Well, hello and welcome to ECON Unit 8, and you're getting a brand new video. Went to my YouTube channel to look at the Week 8 Econ video from 3 years ago to see if it needed to be updated, and it's not there. Okay, so we'll make a new one. It was weird because, again, with Econ, so much of what we're discussing here, the things don't change. I mean, what was true in Econ, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, is still pretty much true today, at least as far as the terms, the definitions are. So I think there's only one I've had to reproduce now with government, because we were talking about contemporary events. There were several new videos I had to produce for that. But be that as it may, Unit 8 is about trade, and in particular, the specter of international trade. So from a definitional standpoint, when we say trade this week, we're referring to more than just the way we classically define a trade. I have an apple, you have an orange, we trade one for the other. In this instance, trade refers to any economic activity that occurs between nations, or quasi-nations in some case. Usually it's about a nation. But it's going to be about any economic activity that involves international economic activity. It all falls under trade. And, of course, some of it is classic trade. We have timber, you have fruit, let's make a deal. But a lot of it is just straight purchasing. If the U.S. purchases 1 million widgets from the EU, then that's called trade insofar as this is concerned. The goal of international trade is just like the goal of any trade between you and someone else. The goal is to create a win-win situation. If it's not a win-win, then it's going to be short-lived and it's not really going to work. Now, yes, we'll get into this later. You are looking out for your own interest, your country's interest. That is your primary concern. But your secondary concern, and a very close number 2, is the concern of your trading partner. If you're not doing them good, then the relationship is not going to last. It's not unlike a marriage. If the other person's not happy, then it's only going to go so far. We'll talk Monday about some of the, ethical ideas about trade. And these questions will make a lot more sense at the end of this. Questions like, should U.S. corporations get subsidies to provide jobs? Should the U.S. rely on tariffs to regulate imports? Should we limit goods imported from other nations to protect our businesses? The answers may seem clear right now, but once you dive into the weeds here, answers might not be so clear-cut. The first chapter is titled Trade is Good. And, well, yeah, when it works, it is good. Keep this in mind. This should undercurrent everything we talk about this week. International trade is complicated. We have a whole industry of people who specialize in international trade, and they routinely get things wrong because there are so many variables to consider. Even people who are considered excellent in this field are going to be wrong quite a bit, simply because there's no way one person can have all the answers on an issue that is just as vast and as complicated as international trade. So keep that in mind. For those of you who were with us for world history, when we were studying Europe, trying to find a route to China, route to India, route to the New World, the main motivating factor for some was religion. They wanted to spread the word of the gospel of Christ. But the number one motivation was trade. There were things that people in the Orient and in Southern Asia had that Europe did not, and they wanted to make a deal. So that is the impetus, or was the impetus, for a lot of exploration, and it's the impetus for a lot of stuff today. Again, trade refers to any activity that's done at the international business level, be it a straight purchase, a traditional trade. It all falls under trade. Trade is supposed to be voluntary exchange. I've got an apple, you've got an orange, let's make a deal. The purpose, again, is to create a win-win arrangement where both sides come out thinking That's a good deal. I can live with that. For instance, companies in the U.S. buy bananas from Honduras, and companies in the U.S. sell medical supplies to companies and the government, even of Honduras. Americans have bananas to enhance their diet, and Hondurans have greater access to medical care. That's a win-win. It would be very difficult to imagine what life in any singular nation state, or any of them, would be like without trade. Again, natural resources. There are some nations that simply do not have the natural resources to produce a lot of very basic stuff. And history has been determined by this. If Japan had the natural resources for rubber, World War II might have looked a little bit different. Who knows? But they could not produce rubber for tires for their aircraft and other military vehicles without being an importer. Of course, during World War II, there wasn't a whole lot of trading going on. And the fact that they had trouble producing something as basic as tires had an impact on world history. Without trade, the citizens of a nation have to settle for inferior goods and services, and both would be relatively more expensive. Trading nations, when they trade and they create these win-win situations, they become interdependent. You lose a little bit of your autonomy there, but you create these win-win situations. Another ancillary benefit of successful trade is good trading partners are much less likely to go to war with one another. That's just the way it is. The principles of specialization are at work when we discuss trade. You remember, like the first week or two of ECON, we talked about the specialization of labor. No one person can do it all. Before man emerged as a social animal, you had to go out, hunt your food. You had to forge the weapon that you used to hunt the food. You had to go kill the food, clean it, fix it, eat it, and in addition to that, you had to make all your own clothes. You had to do everything. As societies formed, we found it was a heck of a lot better to specialize. That is to say, the best hunters go out and hunt, the best clothes makers make clothes, the best builders build places to live and other things. That's specialization of labor. And you see this in international trade. There are nations that have rich natural resources in one respect, but they don't have a lot of another essential natural resource. And there are other nations that have just the opposite problem. So when you create that interdependence, the nation that needs rubber and the nation that needs lumber, they can make a deal, and they are both better for it. Again, there's that phrase again, win-win. The specialization of labor caused mankind to flourish as a social animal because, again, no one person can do every single thing that is required for a standard life. So as we specialized labor, division of labor, specialization of labor, our standard of living went up exponentially. In an ideal situation, that's the way international trade works. Again, even the person that builds his own house, he's not forging his own hammer and nails. He buys them from someone who specializes in producing them. A lot of the things that we've talked about earlier in econ, as far as some of these basic terms, applies to international trade too. Remember the concept of opportunity cost. That is the difference between doing what you're doing for a specified amount of time and energy and the next most profitable thing you could be doing with the same amount of time and energy. Again, I think the example we used earlier was if you could build widgets for 2 hours and make $10, and if you could mow grass for 2 hours and make $8, then the opportunity cost of mowing grass is $2. I'm making $8 doing this, but I could be making $10 doing this. That's the opportunity cost. So you're going to try to choose the one that's the most profitable. Chores in a family, the same way. Mom is probably better at cooking than the 10-year-old boy. They are probably both equally good at taking the trash out. But division of labor allows the kid to take the trash out, mom to cook the food, and that's the greater opportunity cost. That produces the most good for the family. International trade on a much more intricate and lucrative and vastly larger scale is more or less the same thing. The idea that nations specialize in production of certain goods where they have lots of resources and they have a certain talent just makes sense. The book gives a good example. Switzerland is not likely to ever become a major naval power because they're landlocked. They would pay a huge opportunity cost by concentrating on building the world's greatest navy. Now, they have an advantage, though, in banking and in other things, so that's where they clock making, candy making. But yeah, so that's their comparative advantage over other nations. You specialize in what you're good at and what you have the resources for. So yeah, Switzerland would be wasted a lot of time, money, and energy trying to be a naval power. Saudi Arabia has tremendous natural resources of oil, so it would not make sense for them to put an awful lot of energy into creating the world's greatest automotive industry. But they could be an exporter of oil and trade that oil for cars that are made in Japan, a nation that is not that rich, comparatively speaking, in natural resources. Again, undercurrent of all this is that economies are always changing. What you're good at today may not be what you're good at tomorrow. Technology has made a lot of lucrative industries obsolete. So again, when we talk about nation A is good at this, this might not be much in demand at some point. If you are very good at making horse and buggy whips, you're in trouble because there's not much of a demand for that like there was, say, 200 years ago. There's a concept called absolute advantage, where a person or a country can produce goods with less resources. Canada does not need as much resources to make maple syrup as, say, Peru would, because it's in such abundant supply in Canada. Again, that kind of thing. Nations are good in some things, not so good in others in terms of their ability to produce. You have to consider the natural resources a nation has and other comparative advantages. So, I hope you're getting a little inkling here. This can be complicated, but some of the basics are very simple. Again, you concentrate on what you're good at, and you trade out for what you're not good at producing. Restrictions on trade. Anytime that there is international trade, that is the specter of there is the specter of regulation, and there's always going to be some kind of regulation, because if you are importing all your widgets from Europe, what does that do to the American widget industry? There's a trade-off. Again, Thomas Sowell said there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. All the time. Everything. The policy of protectionism is one that protects domestic industries from what the government in the country sees as unfair competition from foreign entities. The most common way a country restricts trade is through something called a tariff. That's basically a tax placed on goods and services that are imported from another nation. One purpose for tariffs is to raise revenue. For a little while there, the largest source of revenue for the federal government was import tariffs. It was long before federal income taxes and all that. But again, in addition to generating a few dollars for Uncle Sam, it also helps to protect domestic industry. Makes sense. If you're importing 10 trillion widgets from Europe, American widget makers all of a sudden become an awful lot less important. Leaders in these industries usually lobby Congress to keep these tariffs very high to protect their interests, the domestic industries. There is a trade-off to that, though. Tariffs also have negative consequences. They lead to higher prices for U.S. consumers. If we were to really boost tariffs on goods imported from China, some of the cheap electronics that we really do like, if we were to do that, then the customer would end up paying an awful lot more for the gadgets they purchase right now. We, as American consumers, have shown we have quite the appetite for reduced price electronics and other gizmos. Secondly, these higher prices would lead to decreased consumption. If iPhones suddenly cost twice as much as they did, you are less likely to buy one. And when consumption is lowered, production is going to be lowered to meet this lower demand. Tariffs can prevent a country from fully enjoying the benefits of free trade. Also, if the U.S. imports fewer goods, other countries will be less likely to sell their goods to the U.S., and a resulting trade war can happen. Do you see how complicated this can be? It can be very complicated. Countries that with the lower tariffs in general experience greater economic growth. Yes, there is a cost to domestic industry. The 1980s U.S. policy on Japanese auto imports are the stuff that are still being studied now in terms of tariffs, good, bad, or usually it's not a yes or no question, it's how much. That's the way it almost always works. Another way governments can restrict imports is by establishing quotas, which is what we did with the automotive industry in Japan. When you limit the supply of foreign goods that are coming in, that tends to drive the prices up. Cars imported from Japan got very popular in the early 1980s, much to the chagrin of the big three automakers here in the U.S. And so lots of import restrictions, quotas, were passed to try to protect American manufacturers. The net result was the price of cars went up a little bit. Japanese cars became a little bit less, but again, we relaxed on that because some of the negative consequences that we mentioned earlier were starting to take a hold. There's also trade sanctions that are placed on nations who are doing bad things. Also, remember, during all this, something as wild as the weather can play into this. If a major humanitarian or natural disaster occurs in a country who almost relies exclusively on their exports of sugar, that can send their economy into a spin, which is why it is better to be good at several different things, because rare is the event that's going to come, that weather event in particular, that's going to impact a whole lot of different industries. Another motivation for sanctions is to protest the policies of another government. We put trade restrictions on South Africa in the 1980s to protest their apartheid policies. Sanctions designed to put pressure on a foreign government to change their policies or social policies are good and bad. And also, the end effect is that the United States, because of its trade position, becomes very reviled. So there are social and ethical questions to consider with international trade as well. Some of the classic ones from history. Should the U.S. have engaged in trade with Nazi Germany in the late 1930s as the Nazis began a policy of exterminating Jewish people? Should the U.S. have traded with the former Soviet Union while that country kept thousands of people incarcerated as political prisoners and did all sorts of other bad things? Not to mention the whole communism thing, which is, in my estimation, evil in and of itself. Looking back on one of our more recent trade sanctions, our embargo of communist Cuba, was it worth it? Did it work? Depends upon who you ask. Cuba is still, for the most part, a very destitute nation because they have very limited trade partnerships. The U.S., no one in the northern hemisphere is trading freely. Now, southern hemisphere, yeah. But and also, what kind of sanctions should we place on China for their obvious human rights abuses? Not always simple. The other aspect of this to consider is the specter of subsidies. Those are government payments to industries who have to compete in a world market where the prices are lower than they are in the producing country. The net effect, similar to that of a tariff. The government gets money from a tariff and pays money with a subsidy. The example the book gives is a pretty good one. I'll kind of read it verbatim. If an American widget maker found themselves competing in the world market where the going price was $1 per widget, but it cost an American manufacturer $2 a widget to produce them, then the U.S. government could respond with a $1 per widget subsidy. Government would pay this directly to the manufacturer, who could then sell their widgets for $1 each, but actually get $2 for each when you add the subsidy to it. The government does that for many agricultural products because of their very volatile nature. Ag products don't always follow perfectly the law of supply and demand simply because there is so much volatility in the market. It offers what's called stabilization for agricultural producers. Here in Southern Virginia, for decades, a big tobacco growing region, there was the Federal Tobacco Stabilization Program. And the idea was to subsidize local tobacco farmers to soften the blows of these inevitable sharp and rises and drops in that economy. Of course, growers in developing nations say they are at a disadvantage, and they very much are on the world stage. Also, subsidies, like I mentioned earlier, they can prevent the forces of supply and demand from arriving at the market price. Anything that disrupts intentionally the law of supply and demand is something you have to treat with suspicion. Subsidies have, yes, they have stabilized things for farmers, but again, there's a trade-off. Anytime you have direct government intervention in the market, you're a little less free, and that's always something to be, at the very least, wary of. The case for free trade, one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, said, underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. I like that. So much of the specter of regulation in any aspect of the government is the underlying question, do you trust me? If a government truly trusts their people, then they will have very few regulations on the economy or anywhere else. Policies that limit free trade, for the most part, impede economic growth and opportunity. Again, the trade-off is you have a little bit of stabilization, a little bit of predictability, but the end result is you, collectively you, are less free. The higher prices that result from tariffs and the money a government spends on subsidies are funds that could go developing the economy, but they don't because of these trade restrictions. Could those dollars be better spent helping American businesses in other ways rather than these direct subsidies or tariffs? It's always a good question to ask. International markets for a nation's output of goods and services mean more jobs, greater economic opportunity, a higher standard of living. If you have a lot of people overseas that want to buy your widgets, that's a good thing, right? Well, yes, it is. And the more free trade you have, the more interdependence you have on multiple nations. What do we say about nations that are interdependent? They're less likely to go to war. They're less likely to be at odds with one another. So, economic freedom and more peace sounds like a pretty good deal. Again, we realize the limitations. Imagine if these 50 United States had 50 different economies and North Carolina competed with Virginia on what would essentially be the international market. Well, we already have sort of a hint of what that would be like in economic development. When Virginia and North Carolina compete for an industry, and we are certainly trying to land big industry at the Berry Hill Mega Park, we're competing with each other, us and North Carolina, to see who can offer them the best deal. Imagine if that fierce level of competition, and it is fierce, if that were applied to all aspects of the economy from a state to a state. That would be maddening, wouldn't it? So yeah, there is a point where competition can become less desirable simply because it can gum up the works, especially when you're on the same side. Virginia and North Carolina eventually are on the same side. We're all under the American economy. It makes no sense for the 50 states to compete against themselves for everything. Again, the U.S. has to be the benefit, not Virginia, not Pennsylvania. For years, of course, we mentioned tariffs were a common part of international trade. We began backing off of some of this in the 1930s. President Franklin Roosevelt was the first to start reciprocal trade agreements, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. And so we started backing away from tariffs. There are still some. But other things like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, the beginning of what we call the most favored nation trading status is where U.S. and, say, Britain, fast allies and everything else, we give Britain a very low tariff on the goods because we like them. We've considered dropping China from the most favored nation trade status to punish them for human rights violations. Again, robust international trade contributes to a great economy and is a symptom of a great economy. Free trade, though, generally speaking, is good because freedom is good. Economic freedom is tied to political freedom. You show me a nation that is economically free, I'll show you a nation that is almost certainly also going to be politically free and socially free. Free trade is about people and nations using their God-given abilities to the best of their efforts. A couple of things here as we close out on, again, sometimes the very complicated world of international trade. Americans privately invest in foreign businesses all the time. Foreign businesses invest here too. It is a global market. American investment in less developed nations allows those nations to grow. Again, much like a small businessman taking out a loan at the bank, it's very hard for him to expand without getting that flush of capital up front. That's why, the banking system is so intrinsically tied to the American economy. This happens on a global scale too. Companies, again, foreign countries and foreign entities make investments in the U.S. And these foreign investments in the U.S., when handled properly, do help the United States grow as well. Foreign investors hold a significant percentage of the debt that the U.S. government owes, which is now up to $37 trillion. As we become more dependent on foreign-held debt, we become a little less free. We become a little more beholden to them. Trade-offs. Trade-offs. Remember that word. Sear that in your brain. Everything is a trade-off. We hear things from time to time about a trade deficit. There is a such thing, obviously, when you're taking in more than you're giving out, or actually, when you're sending out more than you're bringing in. That's a trade deficit. Trade deficits aren't always bad. If I go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk and spend $5 on it, my trade imbalance is $5. Okay, but I've got the thing of milk I went for. So, again, sometimes a trade imbalance is in the eye of the beholder. We hear about trade surpluses, where you are bringing in more than you're sending out. Again, if both sides agree and it's a win-win, that is that kind of overrides everything, does it? If both sides are happy and both sides want to continue doing that, it's okay. So trade, they exist. Trade deficits, trade surpluses, by definition, exist. Whether they're good or bad, sometimes is in the eye of the beholder. The specter of moving American production offshore has been a hot topic for a couple of generations now, particularly here in Southside Virginia. I mentioned NAFTA earlier, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That removed many trade barriers between the U.S. and Mexico. The provisions of NAFTA made it to where labor-intensive industries like the textile industry would have been absolutely foolish not to send their labor, export their production to Mexico, where they don't have a minimum wage and you can produce the same thing for a fraction of the cost. Once you remove those tariffs and the things that even things out, used to be we charged a tariff on imported textiles, now we don't for Mexico. It would have been idiotic for Dan River, Fieldcrest Canada, and others not to send their labor to Mexico. And they did. They would have been doing their shareholders a disservice by doing anything else. So, again, remember when we talked about the law of unintended consequences in terms of taxation, where when the government taxed yachts at a confiscatory level, the millionaires decided just I don't need a yacht, not at that price. The millionaires didn't suffer, but the people who produced the yachts did. The builders, the painters, the laborers, the truckers. And so, all of a sudden, you have $10 billion in anticipated tax collections that you're not getting, but you also had 1,000 people in this industry who are now out of work and are needing government assistance. Unintended consequences. Moving production, or these tariffs that we talk about, can have those unintended consequences as well. It was good for Dan Rivers' shareholders that their company moved production to Mexico. It was not very good for the economy of the city of Danville, because all of a sudden, an industry that employed 12,000 people now employed 0. That's bad. And we paid the price big time. But again, it's trade-offs. From a national standpoint, from sea to shining sea, NAFTA's probably been a net positive. For Danville and vicinity, it has been a very much a net negative. Now, to do again, another cost, the federal government did approve retraining programs for local workers impacted by this. So again, that was an expense you didn't anticipate at first. The NAFTA ended up, costing the U.S. government in that respect. Again, so much of it is about trade-offs. I mean, Thomas Sowell nailed it. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. Sometimes, this is a great story from the book. The moving production offshore has some ironic results. Last year, the largest printer of Bibles in the world was Amity Printing, located in Nanjing, China. The communist Chinese government puts, of course, strict limits on Christians, and it restricts the sale of Bibles within China. However, they have no issue with the company producing Bibles and shipping them elsewhere. So the largest producer of Bibles, Amity, is in a nation that restricts the distribution there. Odd trade policy there, but again, it's China. What you going to do? The increasing economic dependence that the U.S. has had on production, manufacturing in other countries has also been an issue over the past couple of generations. We have learned the hard way in the past couple of decades that not having a robust manufacturing base here in the U.S., it used to be here, now it's, like we said, a lot of it offshore, that has other costs too. When we have pandemics, and stuff is not readily available where it used to be readily available. And so we have learned, again, it is not a bad thing. We are willing to pay, if we're willing to pay a little bit more, because it will cost more to make these widgets in the U.S. than Mexico, but you get other benefits. You get security benefits from not having to rely on foreign nations for your manufacturing base. Again, we can't base our trade policies solely on the advantages Americans gain from it. I'll close with this. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, he played John Nash, a Princeton economist. And, of course, the story was based upon his mental illness. But the theories that made Nash win a Nobel Prize had to do with international trade. And it bucked a lot of the survival of the fittest mode that most nations had used in terms of international trade. What's in it for me? Well, me. Well, yeah. That's enlightened self-interest, and it's not an evil thing by any stretch. One's enlightened self-interest is what creates demand for the butcher, the brewer, and the banker. In international trade, though, Nash demonstrated, and subsequent applications have shown, that there is something to say for taking a short-term loss in order to secure a long-term gain. If you've seen A Beautiful Mind, you'll recognize this. If not, it's a great movie to begin with. But his theory was that if a nation was willing to absorb a short-term loss with an eye towards a long-term fruitful relationship with a trading partner, it is eventually worth it. Again, for a few years, you'll take a little bit of a hit. But for the long term, you will have secured a trade partner, and the benefits will far outweigh the costs. sort of taking one for the team, getting hit by the pitch so you can get on base and score a run, that kind of thing. There's no mathematical quantification for it because you're starting to dip into human emotions, but what have we said? Human emotions, the choices we make, are the lifeblood of econ. Choices. Your choices. Is it worth it? That is the lifeblood of econ, and all of the mathematical charts and graphs in the world sometimes can't quantify it. We'll talk more Monday. Take care.